Presenting today's webinar, Inventory Transparency in the EDI 846, are Patty Wokestein, Director of Sales and Marketing at eZCom Software, Ted Consilla, Director of Client Services, and Dallas Richards, Support Team Manager. So without further ado, I am pleased to turn the program over to our first presenter, Patty Wokestein. Take it away, Patty.
Thank you, Patty. We have two Patties. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Inventory Transparency and the EDI 846. I really appreciate you taking time out and being here today. Now, this educational session that we're going to be focusing on, probably about 35 to 40 minutes, is really going to be focused squarely on the EDI Inventory 846. This is a core informational document that fuels your direct-to-consumer partnerships with your retail trading partners. Now, all EDI is communication, but while other documents, whether they be purchase orders, ASNs, invoices, are all transactional, the EDI 846 is simply informative in nature. It just lets buyers make decisions, but doesn't really commit them to a purchase. So what the team at eZCom, what we're going to be focusing and shedding some light on today are ways on how you're going to be able to remain compliant with your retail partners' EDI 846 requirements. We're also going to be discussing ways how to automate the process and finally provide tips on how to keep transaction costs down. So as far as the speakers, Patty introduced Ted. Ted leads the entire client services setup and implementation at eZCom. He's got over 15 years experience at eZCom. Dallas Richards, who is our customer support manager, they do a great job, and they can certainly speak to a lot of the pain points and challenges that we hear. Now, our familiarity with the retail and integration space really gives vendors the peace of mind that they need to focus their time and energy on the growth and profitability on their core business and not have to worry about sort of the back-end EDI back office. eZCom, we make it easy for vendors to efficiently communicate and process order information using our Lingo software hub. And it's really, we've been around for 20 years, but it's really grown from just an EDI B2B wholesale to D2C to online channels and marketplaces. We're highly recommended as a third-party provider by specialty, luxury, convenience, and big box stores globally. So what Ted is going to be speaking of, we're going to be talking about the small, mid-sized wholesaler manufacturer who's selling retail. So that could be either grocery, housewares, fashion, apparel, accessory, or any kind of consumer product goods. And also if they're doing a mid to high volume of orders. Listen, we all know that there are pain points with a D2C program. There's a lot to cover, but what we've decided is to take a narrow focus on the 846. You know, there could be limited manpower and time and resources, strained relationship with retailers and customers if orders are not shipped on time. You know, sometimes there's manual entry and updating tracking numbers for drop ship orders. Finally, there are really tight profit margins on D2C orders, especially if you're selling products at a low price point. So that's why we thought this was a really sweet spot for vendors to really get some great tips from the professionals at eZCom. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce Ted Consilla, who is going to be sharing the tips and best practices. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Before we dive in on the EDI 846 inventory feed, I'd like to give you some additional context that'll serve as the backdrop of our topic today. Did you know there are different EDI standards across the globe? The least common is TradeAcoms. This was primarily used in the UK and still is, but it's not the predominant standard there any longer. Now there's also EDIFACT, which is the European standard and has largely replaced the Tradecom standard in the UK. The EDIFACT standard is growing in use globally, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. Our company, for example, supports retailer relationships in Australia using the EDIFACT standards. While there might be trading partners in the US that utilize EDIFACT, it's extremely rare. In the US, the predominant EDI standard is ANSI X12, that's ANSI X12. So this is the EDI standard that serves as the backdrop of our discussion today. Now, while you don't need to know how the various EDI standards work or what the differences are between them, that's the job of your EDI provider. They each use different naming conventions for the various documents they support. In the X12 world here in the US, the PO is the 850, the PO change is the 860, the advanced ship notice, or ASN, is the 856, and the invoice is the 810. I mention these documents because you're probably familiar with them, even if you didn't know the various EDI codes. So when we mention the EDI 846, we're talking about, you guessed it, the inventory advice document. Now the EDI 846 here in the US is mainly used as an electronic inventory data feed. In its simplest form, it's used to advise your customers of your on-hand quantities, particularly those with whom you have a dropship to consumer relationship with. In today's retail landscape, the dropship to consumer order flow is more and more dominant, making accurate reporting of your inventory more and more critical. The last thing your retailers want is to upset their customers by selling something on their website that isn't actually available. And this happens regularly. Maybe it's happened to you. I know it's happened to me, where I've purchased an item online only to be notified later that it's unavailable. And that can be frustrating. And your retailers don't want their customers to feel that frustration. So the EDI 846 to the rescue. Reporting accurate inventory to avoid the situation I've just described is super important. It helps ensure a seamless transaction between your trading partner and their customers, but it also helps solidify your company's reputation as a reliable supplier, potentially leading to more business. Now, as I said, the main purpose of this document is to report on-hand quantities, but there are many flavors of this document. These variances are decided by the individual retail trading partners. In addition to on-hand quantity, they may want to know what's out of stock. If it's out of stock, do you have it on order? If so, how many are on order and when are they expected to be available? Also, for suppliers that house particular items in more than one warehouse facility, retail trading partners increasingly want to know the stock levels at each warehouse. Now, hopefully we've explained the what and the why behind the EDI 846. So let's dig into some of the challenges. There can be a myriad of hurdles when trying to comply with the EDI inventory feed, but mainly they boil down to time and money. So let's tackle the ever important money aspect first. The truth is, the cost of doing EDI for a direct-to-consumer order flow is typically higher than the cost of EDI for order shipping to a retailer facility. Direct-to-consumer orders tend to be for one or two items. Orders shipping to retailers' facilities used to stock their in-store shelves tend to be significantly larger. So the cost of EDI is spread out across more sellable units. Regarding the 846, there are two components that affect the cost of compliance: the amount of data each 846 feed contains, and the frequency of your 846 transmissions. So let's look at this more closely because you need to know what you're getting into cost-wise. And this can be tricky because various EDI providers price their EDI documents differently. Now, some EDI providers charge strictly by the amount of data contained in any given document. This pricing model is usually dictated by how many kilocharacters, or KCs, are included in your documents. Every 1,000 characters equals 1 kilocharacter. But how in the world are you supposed to know how many kilocharacters are contained in a document? For EDI providers using this pricing model, it may be hard to get a concrete answer on how much your 846 inventory document will cost each time you send it. Now, you may ask a very straightforward question like, how much will it cost to transmit on-hand quantity for 100 SKUs? That EDI provider may reply, well, it depends on how much item detail you send over for each item. Now, for this KC pricing model, they'd be right to say this. Some trading partners only need to receive the UPC and quantity available, making the corresponding inventory feeds less data intensive. Other trading partners require not only the UPC and quantity available, but your style numbers, item descriptions, on order quantities, etc., making them much more data intensive. So you can see how this conversation can get exhausting very quickly because it'll be difficult to get a clear answer. Now, some providers are transaction-based. One document equals one transaction. I believe this model makes it easier to forecast your 846 cost because then you just need to know, number one, what defines a transaction, and number two, how much does one transaction cost? I can't speak for other EDI providers, but eZCom's pricing model is very easy to grasp. We're transaction-based, and where the 846 document is concerned, every 10 items included on the inventory feed is equal to one transaction, no matter how much detail it includes. But I'm not selling anything here, so if you want to know our transaction rates, you can speak with a member of our sales team at a later time. Here's what I can tell you for sure. The more SKUs you report, the more data intensive your documents are. The more data you send, the more expensive the document becomes. So if the SKU selection you're reporting is limited, the 846 cost is negligible. If, however, you're reporting inventory levels for hundreds or thousands of items, the cost of the 846 can be much higher. As I mentioned earlier, another cost is 846 frequency. The frequency of inventory reporting via the EDI 846 document is determined by each individual retail trading partner. Frequency requirements can vary greatly from multiple times per day at the high end to sending the feed only if and when the item goes from in stock to out of stock and vice versa. Most often though, retail trading partners want the inventory feed once per day. Bottom line, the more often you're required to send the EDI 846 inventory feed, the higher the cost of compliancy. So now that I've thoroughly depressed you, let's talk about solutions, specifically solutions to lower and sometimes eliminate the costs associated with inventory reporting. The best way to limit the costs associated with the EDI 846 is to not use it. Now, this may sound pretty radical, so let me explain. Some retail trading partners outsource the actual data processing of orders, ASNs, and invoices to third parties. You've probably heard of some of them. Commerce Hub, Radial, and Disco are common third parties that some retailers use. In these instances, you can sometimes elect to use EDI for the main suite of documents, such as orders, ASNs, and invoices, but use the retailer's third-party portal for the inventory component. These portals sometimes accommodate a manual upload of a CSV or Excel inventory file. Sometimes they're able to pull in your feeds via FTP, all at no additional charge. Regarding frequency, it's important that you align yourself with an EDI provider that can guide you on this point. As mentioned earlier, different retailers have different frequency requirements. It's important that you understand them, not only to remain compliant, but as a tool in reducing cost. If you're used to sending your inventory feed 3 times per day, but you didn't need to because number 1, the retailer only requires it once per day, and 2, you have plenty of stock remaining, wouldn't you want to know? Or if you're sending your entire inventory file once per day, but your retail trading partner only needs you to report on items that have a change in quantity available, again, you'd want to know, right? This could mean the difference between sending thousands of items each day to sending far less, resulting in significant cost savings. So even with these options to cut costs on your inventory reporting, you have to ask yourself, is this really going to cost me less if I have to manually update inventory for all my direct-to-consumer retail trading partners, all with different portals and reporting tools, and also keep track of their various frequency requirements? Time is also money. Now, I'm going to turn this over to Dallas now to explore this aspect in more detail.
Thanks, Ted. So the time needed to create and send accurate 846s can be intense. As Ted mentioned, the more items you have, the more involved it is and the more moving pieces there are. Some of our customers we've come across have ended up having massive Excel spreadsheets, and they're using these to remove the previous day's sales, add new stock, and any other changes, and then try to run a report off of this to get what their inventory actually is. So getting the right inventory can be tricky. And if it's not exactly right, there's 2 types of problems you can have. And Ted touched on these a little bit. One, you tell your partners you have more of an item than you really have. They sell it, but then you're unable to fulfill it. In this case, the retailer is unhappy because the sale did not happen. And on top of that, there's an upset customer that they might have to appease with a coupon or a credit. The other side of this coin is that you might tell the retailer you have 1 of something when in fact you have 5 of them. So now the retailer sells 1 of your goods, but you have money tied up in the 4 others that are sitting on a shelf that will not sell. Both of these scenarios are pretty bad. Well, depending on how many items you have, you might have to hire a person specifically to keep track of this. Or this might fall on the plate of someone who has a myriad of other responsibilities. So time that could be spent designing, marketing, or even at home with your family could end up being tied up in keeping track of your inventory. Now, as Ted mentioned, many dropship retailers want the 846 to be sent daily. And especially now as we come up into the busy season with Black Friday, Cyber Monday, some retailers will be reaching out to their vendors and asking them to send the inventory more frequently than that. So is the solution just to hire more people to be able to keep up with the inventory load? Well, hopefully not. So one of the problems I mentioned was maintaining an accurate inventory on your side. And this can take a lot of time. So what solutions do we have? First, you need to really become familiar with your retailer's requirements. You want to get to know what they want and what they require. You may also want to have a conversation with your retailer. We had one customer who was made frozen gourmet food to order. They reached out to the retailer and came to an agreement where they didn't have to send the 846 at all because they were making the food on demand. So it's always a conversation worth having with your retailer if you have a scenario that would make it make sense. What other solutions are we have? Well, for the company that has just a few SKUs or stock keeping units and full control over their production, it may mean doing things manually as far as keeping track of your inventory. But you still need to make sure that you can follow the rules of the retailers by sending the inventory on time with the right frequency. In this case, you would want to look for an EDI solution that would allow you to easily update your inventory and create your 846s, perhaps even automatically. For businesses with a larger number of SKUs, there are software tools that can perform some basic inventory functions. But you would really want to pick a software tool that could interface with your EDI solution and interface in a way that makes sense, possibly with a level of automation. So some questions to ask yourself as you're looking at these things. Does your EDI provider offer a way to automatically import files with a simple connector or FTP service? Then can your EDI provider automatically send scheduled 846s? In addition to those two questions, come back to cost. As the 846 can be costly, depending on how much data you are sending, you should see if your service can send updates in a way that makes sense. To illustrate, a retailer wants the vendor to send an 846 every day, but they do not want to see all of your items. They may only want to see the items that have changed since your last 846. At eZCom, our software has a way of comparing what was sent yesterday with what was updated today, and then creating an 846 that has just the changes. For some of our customers, this means the difference of sending an 846 for several thousand items or an 846 with just a few hundred. And this can make a huge difference on cost. Another scenario is there are these large back office software programs like the NetSuites, the SAP Business Ones. These software applications can do all sorts of things: inventory, accounting, fulfillment. If you have one of these, you want to make sure that it can be integrated with your EDI service so that your expensive piece of software can do its job and send the 846s as you wish them to be. And also update your EDI service so that they can be sent out correctly. So by working with your EDI provider, knowing your retailer's requirements, you will then be able to best leverage your systems and your EDI provider's tools. So I'd like to pass things back to Ted for the summary.
Some element related to your business served as the impetus for joining our discussion today. Maybe you're just starting off with direct-to-consumer shipments. Maybe you're just getting acquainted with EDI. Maybe you're a seasoned veteran of both the direct-to-consumer order flow and EDI. Whatever the reason, we hope our discussion today has been informative, even if it simply sparks more questions. Whatever category you fall into, we hope that one of your takeaways is that the 846 doesn't have to usurp all of your resources, both personnel resources and monetary resources. Also, it's important that you align yourself with an EDI service provider that can help you navigate the nuances of the inventory feed and remove the stress surrounding this important document by guiding you through each retailer's unique requirements, helping you streamline the process and advise ways that may help reduce the cost of compliance. With that, we'd like to open up the conversation to questions.
And thank you all. We have received some questions, and we invite you to add any additional questions. In the control panel, you will see a drop box for questions there, so feel free to add those in. The first question we've received is, how often do retailers change their requirements, and how do we find out when they do?
I can take this one.
Great.
So it's the requirement changes from the retailers. It doesn't happen that often, and usually when it does, there is a pretty large outreach from the retailer where they send a lot of emails warning their vendors of the change that's coming, when it's going to happen, and what they'll need to do to accommodate it. And at the same time, at eZCom, when we become aware of those, we often start a large project where we take all of our vendors for that particular retailer and we go through in a very systematic way to make sure that they are all compliant with these requirements if it involves something that we're in control of on the EDI side.
I want to add that sometimes those changes are mapping changes that don't necessarily change the process for the vendor, but then sometimes they do. And so it's important that your EDI provider, whoever you use, communicates in a way that you can understand, that's not speaking, in terms of EDI segments. So in ways that you can understand clearly what needs to happen on your side, what changes you need to make to your process.
Thank you kindly. And secondly, does it ever make sense to send more than the required information to a retailer? For instance, if the retailer doesn't require an item description, should we provide one anyway, or will that just cost us more money?
Well, it depends on the service that you're using. So from eZCom's perspective, it would not cost you more money to send an item description. With some retailers, it might. But keep in mind that if the retailer doesn't need an item description, they may not even be mapped for it. So you could include it, but it may not even go out in the data that you send because they are not mapped to receive it. So, so basically what I'm saying is that your interface, you may see the item description, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go out in the EDI data. If it's an optional element, so that if you provide it, and it will go out if you provide it, then again, eZCom would not charge you more for that. I don't know that it would necessarily do you any good or benefit you more to send it, but it wouldn't hurt. But with EDI providers that charge by kilocharacter, well, yes, it would cost more money.
That makes sense. Right, and if I don't have the inventory already, but I know it's on the way to my warehouse, can I include it in an 846?
I think Dallas and I will both agree that you should not send it on an 846 until you have it, or that you're absolutely certain you're going to have it that day, because you're basically saying in the 846, I have this now. And so if you don't really have it now, you really shouldn't include it as having quantity available.
To add to that, some retailers may want to see what you have on order. So it might, depending on the retailer's requirements, it might wish to include it if it has an arrival date that's in the future that is telling the retailer this will be available next week once the truck gets to the warehouse, or once it arrives and gets checked in, but it would not be sent over as available now.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. All right, I have a question here. Will an 846 be necessary for customers that are non-direct to customer shipments, like those who would ship to a Walmart DC only?
Typically, the 846 is not used for non-direct to consumer EDI relationships.
Okay, so it would not be. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to raise at this time? Oh, here is one. Can I set up automation of an 846 myself in Lingo?
Yeah, we have some built-in tools within Lingo that allow you to set up a 846 to be sent out at a certain time of day or multiple times a day, and also describe within Lingo what the criteria is for picking items to go onto that 846. Now, this would still require you to update the inventory within Lingo, but then our software would look at those updates and, based on how you have it configured, create an 846 and send it to the retailer on the schedule you determine.
All right, thank you. Do we have any other late-breaking questions? We'll wait for a moment for you to type. All right, and hearing none, I'd like to thank you for being with us today on behalf of RVCF and eZCom software. We're glad to have you here. We will be sending out a link to the on-demand version of this webinar following the program as soon as the file is available. And if you have any future questions about the material covered in today's presentation, please feel free to contact Patty Wolkstein directly at pwolkstein, WOLKSTEIN, at eZcomsoftware.com, or at the email address that is being shown on the screen, sales@eZcomsoftware.com. Thank you all for being here and have a great day. Bye all. Thank you, team.